The smell of burnt toast filled the tiny kitchen of the Matthews family apartment on Corktown's grittiest street. Sarah pressed her face against the grimy window, watching her older brother Marcus stride confidently toward the school bus, his pristine student council badge catching the morning sunlight. At 17, Marcus was everything their mother, Elena Matthews, had dreamed of in a son. Valedictorian material, debate team captain, already accepted to Harvard on a full scholarship. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Sarah, at 15, was everything Marcus wasn't. "Get away from that window and eat your breakfast," Elena snapped, not bothering to look up from the stack of bills she was sorting at the kitchen table. Her hospital scrubs were wrinkled from her double shift the night before, and the dark circles under her eyes spoke of years spent working herself to the bone to keep the family afloat, since Sarah's father had walked out when she was 8. Sarah slumped into the mismatched chair across from her mother, poking at the charred bread with a fork. The apartment's thin walls did nothing to muffle the sounds of their neighbors' morning routines: crying babies, shouting matches, the constant rumble of traffic from the nearby freeway. It was a world away from the pristine suburban neighborhoods where Marcus's friends lived, but it was all they could afford on Elena's salary as a hospital aide. "Mrs. Peterson called last night," Elena said without looking up, her voice carrying that familiar edge of disappointment that made Sarah's stomach clench. "Says you got another detention for arguing with Mr. Williams about his history lesson." Sarah's jaw tightened. He was wrong about the civil rights timeline. "I had sources." "Sources?" Elena's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You think having sources gives you the right to disrespect your teachers? You think that attitude is going to get you anywhere in life? Maybe if you actually listened to what I was trying to." "Don't." Elena's hand slammed down on the table, making the chipped coffee mug jump. "Don't you dare talk back to me, Sarah Elizabeth Matthews. I work 16-hour days to keep a roof over your head, and this is what I get? A daughter who can't keep her mouth shut in class?" The familiar sting of tears burned behind Sarah's eyes, but she'd learned years ago not to let them fall in front of her mother. Elena Matthews had no patience for what she called waterworks, especially not from a daughter who seemed determined to waste every opportunity handed to her. "Your brother never gave me this kind of trouble," Elena continued, her voice rising with each word. "Marcus knew how to show respect, how to work hard without making excuses. You want to know the difference between you two? He understands that success comes from knowing your place and working within the system, not fighting it every step of the way." Sarah stared down at her plate, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She'd heard this speech countless times before, but it never got easier, never stopped feeling like a knife twisting in her chest. "You think you're so smart with all your questions and your arguments," Elena went on, seemingly oblivious to the pain she was inflicting. "But intelligence without discipline is worthless. Marcus is going to be something great. A lawyer, maybe, or a doctor. He's going to make something of himself because he knows how to follow rules and respect authority." The school bus honked outside, its harsh sound cutting through the morning air like a warning bell. Sarah grabbed her worn backpack and headed for the door, but Elena's voice stopped her cold. "You'll never be like your brother, Sarah. The sooner you accept that, the easier your life will be." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She turned to look at her mother, searching Elena's face for any sign that she didn't mean it, that somewhere beneath the exhaustion and frustration was a mother who believed in her daughter's potential. But Elena had already turned back to her bills, dismissing Sarah as easily as she might swat away a fly. Sarah walked to school that morning with her mother's words echoing in her head like a broken record. The autumn air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the stuffiness of the apartment. But even the beautiful morning couldn't lift the weight that had settled on her shoulders. Around her, other kids chatted and laughed as they made their way to Jefferson High. But Sarah felt invisible, like she was walking through a world that had no place for her. The school building loomed ahead, its red brick facade crumbling in places and covered with a thin layer of grime that seemed to match the neighborhood's overall sense of resignation. Jefferson High wasn't the worst school in Detroit, but it wasn't far from it. The hallways smelled of industrial cleaner and teenage desperation, and the classrooms were overcrowded with students who had learned early that the system wasn't designed for their success. Sarah's first period was American history with Mr. Williams, the same teacher who had given her detention the day before. She slipped into her seat in the back row, hoping to avoid his attention, but Mr. Williams had a talent for calling on the students who least wanted to participate. "Miss Matthews," he said, his nasal voice cutting through the classroom chatter. "Perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on yesterday's discussion about the Supreme Court's role in civil rights legislation." Every head in the classroom turned toward Sarah, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. This was exactly what her mother had warned her about: drawing attention to herself, making waves when she should be keeping her head down and following the curriculum without question. But something inside Sarah refused to stay quiet. Maybe it was the memory of her mother's dismissive words that morning. Or maybe it was the way Mr. Williams was smirking at her, clearly expecting her to stumble. Whatever it was, it gave her the courage to speak up. "I think the Supreme Court has historically been both a barrier and a catalyst for civil rights progress," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "Cases like Plessy v. Ferguson showed how the court could be used to institutionalize discrimination, while Brown v. Board demonstrated its potential to dismantle unjust systems." Mr. Williams's smirk faltered slightly. "That's a rather sophisticated analysis for someone who couldn't be bothered to turn in her homework assignment." Sarah felt her face flush again, but this time it was with anger rather than embarrassment. "My homework was turned in. It's probably buried under the stack of papers on your desk that you haven't bothered to grade yet." A few students snickered, and Mr. Williams's face darkened. "Detention. Again. And this time, maybe you'll learn that smart-mouthing your teachers won't get you anywhere in life." As Sarah walked out of the classroom that afternoon with her second detention slip in 2 days, she couldn't help but think about her mother's words. Maybe Elena was right. Maybe she was destined to be nothing more than a troublemaker, someone who questioned authority when she should be accepting it. Maybe Marcus really was the successful one, the child who would make their mother proud, while Sarah remained the disappointment. But deep down, beneath the hurt and frustration, something else was growing. A stubborn determination that refused to be extinguished by her mother's pessimism or her teacher's condescension. Sarah might not know exactly what she wanted to become, but she was beginning to understand what she didn't want to be: silent, compliant, willing to accept that her questions and challenges were character flaws rather than strengths. The detention hall was nearly empty when Sarah arrived, just her and 2 other students who looked as resigned to their fate as she felt. She pulled out a worn paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that she'd found at a garage sale and lost herself in the story of Atticus Finch and his unwavering belief in justice. There was something about the way Harper Lee wrote about standing up for what was right, even when the whole world seemed against you, that resonated with something deep in Sarah's soul. When the detention supervisor finally dismissed them an hour later, Sarah walked home through the darkening streets with a strange sense of purpose beginning to crystallize in her mind. She didn't know exactly what form it would take, but she was starting to understand that her refusal to accept simple answers might not be a flaw after all. Maybe it was exactly the quality she would need to prove her mother wrong. The apartment was empty when she arrived home. Elena was working another double shift, and Marcus was at debate practice, preparing for the state championships that would undoubtedly add another trophy to his already impressive collection. Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her homework spread out before her, but instead of focusing on the assignments, she found herself researching famous lawyers and judges, reading about people who had used the legal system to create change rather than simply maintain the status quo. She read about Thurgood Marshall, who had argued Brown v. Board before the Supreme Court, and later became the first African-American justice. She learned about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had fought tirelessly for gender equality before ascending to the highest court in the land. These were people who had questioned authority, who had challenged unjust systems, and refused to accept the world as it was. As the night grew later and the apartment remained quiet except for the distant sounds of the city, Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of her entire life. She was going to become a lawyer. Not the kind of lawyer Marcus might become, successful and respected, but ultimately working within existing power structures. She was going to be the kind of lawyer who challenged those structures, who used the law as a tool for justice rather than simply a means to an end. It was a decision born from hurt and defiance, but it was also born from hope. Hope that her mother's words weren't the final verdict on her potential. Hope that her tendency to question and challenge could be channeled into something meaningful. And hope that someday, in some courtroom somewhere, she would prove that the daughter Elena Matthews had written off as a troublemaker could rise higher than anyone had ever imagined. The Wayne State University admissions office smelled like old coffee and broken dreams. Sarah clutched her acceptance letter with sweaty palms, watching Elena's face cycle through emotions she couldn't quite read. It had been 3 years since that morning in the kitchen, when her mother declared she'd never be like Marcus, and the distance between them had only grown wider with each passing semester of high school. Community college would have been more practical, Elena finally said, folding the letter with mechanical precision. This is going to cost money we don't have. Sarah bit back the response that burned on her tongue. She'd worked 3 part-time jobs throughout her senior year, tutoring kids in the neighborhood, stocking shelves at the corner market, and cleaning offices downtown after school. Every dollar had gone toward college applications and the dream of studying pre-law. But Elena saw only the burden, never the ambition. Marcus had graduated from Harvard the previous spring and was already working at a prestigious law firm in Boston. His framed Harvard diploma dominated the living room wall like a shrine to everything Sarah wasn't supposed to aspire to. During his rare phone calls home, Elena would light up in ways Sarah had never witnessed, asking about his cases, his apartment, his girlfriend from a well-connected family. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. I got a partial scholarship, Sarah said quietly, and I can work while I study. Work and study? Elena's laugh held no warmth. You think you can handle both when you couldn't even keep your grades consistent in high school? You think college professors are going to tolerate that attitude of yours? The familiar knot formed in Sarah's stomach, but something had changed in the years since her mother's pronouncement. The hurt was still there, sharp and persistent, but it had been joined by something harder, something that refused to bend under Elena's skepticism. Wayne State's campus buzzed with the energy of new beginnings when Sarah arrived for orientation that fall. The Gothic Revival buildings stretched toward the Detroit skyline, their stone facades weathered by decades of Michigan winters but still standing proud. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt like she belonged somewhere that valued questions over compliance. Her dormitory roommate was Jennifer Walsh, a bubbly education major from Grand Rapids whose parents had sent care packages filled with homemade cookies and encouraging notes. Jennifer's family called every Sunday, asking about her classes, her friends, her dreams. Sarah listened to these conversations from her desk across the room, pretending to study while absorbing the foreign concept of unconditional parental support. "Your mom never calls," Jennifer observed one evening as they walked back from the library. "She's busy," Sarah replied, which was true but incomplete. Elena worked her shifts at the hospital and came home to an empty apartment, where she watched television alone and counted the days until Marcus might visit. There was no room in that routine for checking on a daughter who had chosen the harder path. Professor Catherine Reynolds taught Introduction to Constitutional Law in the basement of the law school building. She was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to your core. On the first day of class, she wrote a single question on the blackboard. What does justice mean when the law itself is unjust? Sarah's hand shot up before she could stop herself. Around her, other students shifted uncomfortably, clearly hoping someone else would tackle such a loaded question. But Sarah had been thinking about this exact paradox since high school, since those afternoons researching civil rights lawyers in her empty apartment. Justice becomes an act of resistance, she said, her voice carrying further than she'd intended. When laws protect systems of oppression, Seeking true justice means challenging the very foundations those laws rest on. Professor Reynolds studied her for a long moment. Interesting perspective, miss? Matthews. Sarah Matthews. Well, Miss Matthews, you'll find that perspective both challenged and refined over the next 4 years. I hope you're prepared for the discomfort that comes with examining your assumptions. The class became Sarah's anchor. While other students focused on memorizing precedents and procedures, she found herself drawn to the spaces between the lines, the places where interpretation met conscience. She wrote papers that made her professors uncomfortable, arguing for broader readings of constitutional protections and questioning the historical contexts that had shaped current legal doctrine. Her academic advisor, Dr. Michael Chen, called her into his office during her sophomore year with a concerned expression that immediately put Sarah on edge. "Your grades are excellent," he began, "but your professors have concerns about your approach to legal analysis." Sarah's heart sank. "What kind of concerns?" "They feel you're too willing to challenge established precedent without fully understanding the practical implications. Legal practice requires a certain degree of pragmatism, Sarah. Clients need lawyers who can work within existing systems, not revolutionaries who want to tear everything down." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Even here, in a place she'd believed would value her analytical mind, she was being told to conform, to accept limitations on her thinking. It was her mother's voice all over again, dressed up in academic language but carrying the same message: know your place. "So what are you suggesting?" she asked. "Consider focusing your studies on areas where your passionate advocacy might be more appropriate. Family law, perhaps, or civil rights work with established nonprofits. Fields where your idealism can be channeled productively without disrupting institutional stability." Sarah left that meeting with a familiar fire burning in her chest. Every authority figure in her life seemed determined to convince her that her instinct to question and challenge was a character flaw to be corrected rather than a strength to be developed. But something had shifted during her time at Wayne State. She'd found her voice in Professor Reynolds' classroom, discovered that her tendency to dig deeper and demand better answers wasn't just acceptable, it was necessary. She began spending her free time in the law library, not just reading assigned cases, but tracing the evolution of legal thought through decades of decisions. She studied how Brown v. Board had overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, how Miranda rights had emerged from a single defendant's challenge, how countless legal precedents that now seemed obvious had once been radical departures from accepted practice. The patterns became clear. Legal progress happened when lawyers were willing to push boundaries, to argue for interpretations that established authorities initially resisted. The very precedents her professors now taught as settled law had once been the kind of disruptive challenges they were discouraging her from pursuing. During her junior year, Sarah took an internship with the Detroit Legal Aid Society, a nonprofit organization that provided legal services to low-income residents. The office occupied the third floor of a converted warehouse in downtown Detroit, its windows overlooking vacant lots and struggling businesses that told the story of a city fighting to reinvent itself. Her supervisor was Rebecca Torres, a seasoned attorney who had graduated from University of Michigan Law School 15 years earlier and chosen to work in legal aid rather than pursue the corporate track that most of her classmates had followed. Rebecca was everything Sarah hoped to become: brilliant, passionate, and completely unafraid to challenge systems that didn't serve their clients' needs. "The law isn't neutral," Rebecca told Sarah during her first week. "Every statute, every precedent, every procedural rule was written by people with particular perspectives and interests. Our job isn't just to apply those rules, it's to understand who they serve and who they exclude." Sarah's first case involved an elderly woman named Dorothy Jefferson who was facing eviction from the apartment she'd lived in for 30 years. The landlord claimed she owed back rent, but the documentation was suspicious, and Sarah discovered that similar eviction notices had been filed against multiple long-term tenants in buildings throughout the neighborhood. "It's gentrification by legal harassment," Rebecca explained as they reviewed the case files. "These landlords know that most tenants can't afford lawyers, so they file bogus eviction proceedings, hoping people will just move out rather than fight." Sarah dove into the research with an intensity that surprised even herself. She spent hours tracing property ownership records, analyzing rent control ordinances, and identifying patterns in the eviction filings. What she found was a systematic campaign to remove long-term residents from buildings that could then be renovated and rented at much higher rates. "We need to file a class action," Sarah told Rebecca after presenting her findings. "This isn't just about Mrs. Jefferson. It's about protecting an entire community from predatory practices." Rebecca smiled, the expression of a mentor watching a student grasp something crucial. "Now you're thinking like a lawyer. Not just solving individual problems, but identifying systemic issues and crafting comprehensive solutions." The class action lawsuit took 8 months to prepare and another 6 months to work its way through the courts. Sarah wrote briefs, interviewed witnesses, and spent countless hours in law libraries researching precedents that might support their arguments. She watched Rebecca argue before judges who seemed skeptical of their claims, defending legal theories that pushed the boundaries of existing tenant protection laws. When they finally won, securing not just Mrs. Jefferson's apartment but new protections for hundreds of other tenants, Sarah felt something click into place. This was what she'd been searching for since high school, this combination of intellectual rigor and moral purpose. This was how her tendency to question authority could become a force for actual change. The victory made local news, and Sarah's name appeared in the Detroit Free Press as part of the legal team that had, quote, challenged exploitative housing practices. She clipped the article and mailed it to her mother without a note, not because she expected praise, but because she needed Elena to see that her daughter's stubborn refusal to accept injustice had led somewhere meaningful. Elena's response came 3 days later in the form of a brief phone call. "I saw the newspaper article," she said without preamble. "And?" "Marcus got promoted to junior partner at his firm. They're giving him his own office." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar ache of disappointment. Even when she succeeded, even when her work made headlines, Elena's attention remained fixed on Marcus's conventional achievements. But something had changed in Sarah during those months preparing the class action case. The need for her mother's approval hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined her sense of worth. "That's great for Marcus," she said simply. "He's making real money now, Sarah, building a real career. That legal aid work you're doing, it's admirable, I suppose, but it's not going to pay your bills." Maybe paying bills isn't the only measure of success. The silence stretched between them across the phone lines, filled with years of misunderstanding and missed connections. Finally, Elena spoke again, her voice softer but no less concerned. "I just don't want you to struggle, Sarah. I've watched too many people fight systems they can't change. Sometimes acceptance is a form of wisdom." After Elena hung up, Sarah sat in her apartment staring at the framed newspaper clipping on her desk. Her mother's words echoed in her head, but they no longer carried the power to derail her sense of purpose. She was beginning to understand that her path wouldn't be Marcus's path, and that was exactly the point. The next morning, she started researching law schools for her graduate applications. Not just any law schools, the best ones, the institutions that trained Supreme Court clerks and federal judges, and the kind of lawyers who shaped legal precedent rather than simply following it. If her mother believed she'd never measure up to Marcus's achievements, Sarah was determined to aim higher than either of them had ever imagined. The applications were due in 6 months, and Sarah had work to do. The envelope from Yale Law School arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, its cream-colored paper feeling heavier than it should have in Sarah's trembling hands. She'd applied to 8 law schools, but Yale had been her impossible dream, the institution that had produced more Supreme Court justices than any other, where constitutional law wasn't just studied, but actively shaped. Jennifer found her sitting on their dorm room floor 20 minutes later, still staring at the unopened envelope. "Well?" Jennifer demanded, bouncing on her toes with nervous energy. "Are you going to read it, or frame it unopened?" Sarah's fingers found the edge of the flap, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead and a sentence that would change everything. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted to Yale Law School's class of 2012. The acceptance came with a partial scholarship, not enough to cover everything, but enough to make the impossible merely extremely difficult. Sarah would need loans, work-study positions, and every penny she could scrape together from summer jobs. But she was going to Yale. Elena's reaction was predictably complicated. Yale? She repeated the word like it was a foreign language. Sarah, that's very prestigious. For the first time in years, Sarah heard something approaching pride in her mother's voice. But it was quickly overshadowed by practical concerns. How are you going to pay for it? Those loans will follow you for decades. Marcus went to Harvard on scholarship because he was at the top of his class. Are you sure you can handle the competition? Sarah had learned to parse her mother's language over the years. Buried in Elena's worries was an acknowledgement that her daughter had achieved something remarkable, even if she couldn't quite bring herself to celebrate it openly. It wasn't the wholehearted support Sarah had always craved, but it was more than she'd expected. Marcus called that evening from Boston, his voice carrying an odd mix of surprise and genuine congratulation. Yale Law is no joke, Sarah. That's incredibly impressive. Thanks, she said, still processing the surreal reality of her acceptance. You know, I have some contacts there, professors I met at conferences, alumni events. I could put in a word, help you get connected when you arrive. It was the first time Marcus had ever offered to help her with anything, and Sarah found herself unexpectedly touched by the gesture. For all their differences, for all the years she'd felt like she was competing with his shadow, he was still her brother. New Haven in September felt like stepping into a different universe. Yale's Gothic Revival campus sprawled across the city like an academic cathedral, its stone buildings and manicured courtyards speaking of centuries of tradition and intellectual achievement. Sarah's classmates arrived with designer luggage and casual references to family connections, their confidence as polished as their resumes. During orientation week, she attended a mixer for first-generation college students, a gathering that felt both validating and isolating. Most of her classmates had parents who were lawyers, doctors, or business executives. Sarah was one of only 3 students whose parents hadn't attended college at all. Professor Diana Hartwell taught constitutional law in a lecture hall that had witnessed decades of future legal minds grappling with fundamental questions of justice and governance. She was a formidable woman in her 60s who had argued multiple cases before the Supreme Court and served as a federal appellate judge before returning to academia. The Constitution, Professor Hartwell announced on the first day, is not a museum piece. It's a living document that requires constant interpretation, constant evolution, constant challenge to remain relevant to contemporary society. Sarah felt a familiar thrill at those words, the same intellectual excitement she'd experienced in Professor Reynolds's classroom, but amplified by the weight of being at an institution where such challenges were not only welcomed but expected. Her study group included David Kim, whose father was a federal judge in California, Amanda Peterson, whose family owned a prominent law firm in Connecticut, and Robert Chen, whose mother was a Supreme Court clerk turned corporate attorney. They were brilliant, accomplished, and utterly comfortable in environments that still felt foreign to Sarah. You have interesting perspectives, Amanda told her after a particularly heated discussion about Fourth Amendment protections. Very grassroots. Sarah wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a polite way of highlighting her outsider status. She was learning that Yale operated on multiple levels of communication, where direct statements were often layered with subtext she was still deciphering. Her constitutional law seminar that spring focused on landmark cases that had expanded civil rights protections. Professor Hartwell assigned each student a case to analyze not just for its legal precedent, but for the social and political forces that had made such precedent possible. Sarah chose Loving v. Virginia, the 1967 case that struck down laws prohibiting interracial marriage, but instead of focusing solely on the legal arguments, she traced the personal stories of Richard and Mildred Loving, examining how their quiet persistence had challenged an entire system of racial oppression. What interests me, she wrote in her final paper, is how transformative legal change often begins not with grand legal theories, but with ordinary people refusing to accept that unjust laws represent immutable reality. Professor Hartwell's feedback was brief but significant. Exceptional analysis. Consider exploring this intersection of personal narrative and constitutional evolution in your future work. That summer, Sarah secured an internship with the ACLU's national office in New York, working on voting rights cases in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United. The office buzzed with the energy of lawyers fighting battles on multiple fronts: campaign finance reform, reproductive rights, criminal justice reform, immigration. Her supervisor was Maria Gonzalez, a Harvard Law graduate who had turned down offers from white-shoe firms to pursue civil rights litigation. Maria had grown up in East Los Angeles, the daughter of immigrants who had worked multiple jobs to support her education. The law can be a weapon or a shield, Maria told Sarah during her first week. The question is whether you're using it to protect existing power structures or to challenge them. Sarah's first assignment involved researching voter suppression tactics in key swing states, documenting how seemingly neutral election laws disproportionately affected minority and low-income communities. The patterns she uncovered were both sophisticated and damning. Literacy tests replaced by voter ID requirements, poll taxes replaced by registration obstacles, outright discrimination replaced by surgical targeting of communities likely to vote for progressive candidates. This is deliberate, Sarah told Maria after weeks of research. These aren't isolated incidents or unintended consequences. This is systematic disenfranchisement using legal mechanisms. Now you're getting it, Maria replied. The question is, what are we going to do about it? They spent the rest of the summer crafting a comprehensive legal strategy to challenge voter suppression efforts across multiple states. Sarah wrote briefs, researched precedents, and helped prepare arguments that would eventually be presented to federal courts. For the first time since arriving at Yale, she felt like her outsider perspective was an asset rather than a liability. The work was exhausting and often frustrating. Federal judges who had been appointed by conservative presidents were skeptical of arguments about voter suppression, questioning whether the patterns Sarah had documented represented discrimination or simply lawful election administration. But there were victories too: injunctions that stopped voter purges, court orders that extended registration deadlines, precedents that established new protections for voting rights. When Sarah returned to Yale for her second year, she carried herself differently. The imposter syndrome that had plagued her first year had been replaced by quiet confidence in her abilities and her purpose. She knew what kind of lawyer she wanted to become. Professor Hartwell approached her after a seminar on equal protection jurisprudence. "I've been following your work with the ACLU," she said. "Impressive research on voter suppression tactics. Have you given thought to your career trajectory after graduation?" "I want to continue in civil rights law," Sarah replied. "Constitutional litigation specifically." "Good, there's someone I'd like you to meet." The following week, Professor Hartwell introduced Sarah to Justice William Chang, who was visiting Yale to deliver a lecture on the evolving interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Justice Chang had been appointed to the Supreme Court 5 years earlier, and his opinions had consistently expanded protections for marginalized communities. "Professor Hartwell tells me you're interested in constitutional law," he said during a private meeting in the dean's office. "Yes, Your Honor. Specifically, how constitutional principles can be applied to address contemporary challenges to civil rights." Justice Chang studied her with sharp, intelligent eyes. "What's your long-term goal, Miss Matthews?" Sarah took a breath, then said something she'd never voiced aloud. "I want to argue cases before the Supreme Court. I want to help shape constitutional interpretation for the next generation." Justice Chang nodded slowly. "That's an ambitious goal. Are you prepared for the challenges that come with that level of ambition?" "I've been preparing my whole life, Your Honor." After Justice Chang left Yale, Professor Hartwell called Sarah into her office. "Justice Chang was impressed with you," she said. "He's looking for clerks for next term. It's a competitive process, but he specifically asked me to encourage you to apply." A Supreme Court clerkship was the golden ticket of legal careers, a one-year position that provided unparalleled insight into the court's operations and virtually guaranteed career opportunities at the highest levels of the legal profession. Sarah had dreamed of such an opportunity but never believed it was realistic for someone from her background. "I don't understand," Sarah said. "There must be dozens of candidates with better credentials." "Justice Chang isn't looking for better credentials," Professor Hartwell replied. "He's looking for someone who understands that the law exists to serve people, not the other way around. Someone who won't forget that constitutional principles matter most when they protect those who lack political power. The application process was grueling. Multiple interviews, writing samples, recommendations from every professor Sarah had worked with closely. Justice Chang's questions probed not just her legal knowledge, but her fundamental beliefs about the role of courts in society. "Why do you want to be here?" he asked during her final interview. Sarah thought about her mother's words from years ago, about Marcus's conventional success, about all the authority figures who had tried to convince her that challenging existing systems was a character flaw to be corrected. "Because I believe the Constitution's promises are meaningless unless they apply to everyone," she said, "and I want to help ensure that they do." The call came on a Friday afternoon in March. Justice Chang's voice was warm but professional. "Miss Matthews, I'd like to offer you a position as my law clerk beginning this October." Sarah had to sit down. At that moment, she thought about the 15-year-old girl who had argued with her history teacher, the college student who had been told to temper her idealism, the law student who had felt like an outsider among her privileged classmates. That girl would be working at the Supreme Court of the United States. She called Elena first, her hands shaking as she dialed. "Mom, I got the clerkship. I'm going to be working for a Supreme Court justice." The silence stretched so long, Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice thick with an emotion Sarah couldn't identify. "Sarah, I don't even know what to say." "You could say congratulations." "Congratulations." Elena's voice cracked slightly. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. I've always been proud of you, even when I didn't know how to show it." It wasn't the validation Sarah had craved as a teenager, but it meant more now than it would have then. She'd found her own path, proven her own worth, and created her own definition of success. Her mother's approval was a gift, but it was no longer a necessity. When she hung up the phone, Sarah sat in her dorm room, looking out at Yale's campus, where students hurried between classes and professors debated constitutional principles that would shape the nation's future. In a few months, she would be at the center of American jurisprudence, helping to craft decisions that would affect millions of lives. The girl who had been told she'd never be like her brother was about to become something Marcus had never even attempted to be, a Supreme Court law clerk, positioned to influence the highest levels of American law. But more than that, she was becoming exactly who she had always been meant to be, someone who refused to accept that injustice was inevitable, who believed that the law could be a tool for creating the world she wanted to see. The Supreme Court building rose before Sarah like a temple to American jurisprudence, its marble columns gleaming white against the October morning sky. She paused at the bottom of the steps, briefcase in hand, trying to absorb the magnitude of the moment. The inscription above the entrance, "Equal justice under law," seemed to pulse with possibility and responsibility in equal measure. Security cleared her through multiple checkpoints before she found herself in Justice Chang's chambers, a suite of offices that felt more like a scholarly sanctuary than a workplace. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held centuries of legal precedent, while tall windows offered views of the Capitol Dome. The air hummed with intellectual energy and the weight of decisions that would shape American law for generations. Justice Chang greeted her in his private office, a surprisingly modest space dominated by a simple wooden desk and chairs that had seen decades of constitutional contemplation. At 62, he possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from years of careful judicial reasoning, his graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving him an almost professorial appearance. "Welcome to the court, Sarah," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I hope you're prepared for the most intellectually challenging year of your life." Sarah's three fellow clerks were exactly what she'd expected, brilliant graduates from Harvard, Stanford, and Columbia, who spoke casually about their law review articles and family connections to the legal establishment. Thomas Bradford III came from a family of federal judges. Catherine Williams had graduated summa cum laude and served as editor-in-chief of the Harvard Law Review. David Park had worked for 2 years at the most prestigious appellate firm in Washington before arriving at the court. They were polite, professional, and utterly confident in ways that reminded Sarah of her Yale classmates. During their first meeting, they discussed their backgrounds with the casual efficiency of people accustomed to impressive resumes. "I worked on constitutional issues at Latham and Watkins," Catherine mentioned. "Mostly corporate constitutional law, but some interesting Commerce Clause cases. I did 2 years at the D.C. Circuit before coming here, Thomas added. Judge Patterson's chambers. Fantastic preparation for this kind of work. When they turned to Sarah, she felt the familiar flutter of imposter syndrome. I worked with the ACLU on voting rights cases, she said simply. The slight pause that followed spoke volumes. Civil rights work was respected, certainly, but it wasn't the typical pathway to a Supreme Court clerkship. Sarah could see them recalibrating their assumptions about her background and qualifications. Justice Chang's chambers operated with military precision. Cases arrived in neat stacks, each accompanied by voluminous records from lower courts, amicus briefs from interested parties, and legal arguments that represented years of careful preparation. Sarah's first assignment involved a religious liberty case that pitted constitutional protections against anti-discrimination laws. Exactly the kind of complex balancing that made Supreme Court jurisprudence so challenging. I want you to research the historical context of the Free Exercise Clause, Justice Chang told her. Not just the obvious cases, but the social and political circumstances that led the framers to include religious protections in the First Amendment. Sarah dove into the research with the same intensity she'd brought to her ACLU work, but the stakes felt exponentially higher. Her analysis wouldn't just inform an academic paper or a lower court brief. It would help shape a Supreme Court opinion that would guide American law for decades. The more she researched, the more complex the issue became. The framers had clearly intended to protect religious practice from government interference. But they'd written those protections in an era when religious diversity meant different Christian denominations, not the pluralistic society America had become. How should 18th century principles apply to 21st century conflicts between religious belief and civil rights? Her memo to Justice Chang explored this tension without offering easy answers. She traced the evolution of free exercise jurisprudence from its origins through landmark cases like Employment Division versus Smith and Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, analyzing how the court had balanced competing constitutional values across different historical contexts. Interesting analysis, Justice Chang said after reviewing her work. You're not trying to force the historical record to support a predetermined conclusion. That's rarer than you might think. The comment gave Sarah insight into Justice Chang's judicial philosophy. He wasn't an ideologue seeking to advance a particular political agenda, but a careful legal craftsman trying to apply constitutional principles fairly across a wide range of cases. It was exactly the kind of approach Sarah had hoped to learn from. Oral arguments were Sarah's favorite part of the court's operations. Twice a week, the nation's best attorneys stood before 9 justices to defend legal positions that had taken years to develop. Sarah sat in the court's public gallery, taking notes as lawyers navigated complex questioning from justices who had spent decades refining their constitutional interpretations. During a case involving Fourth Amendment protections in the digital age, Sarah watched Justice Chang probe the government's attorney about the scope of electronic surveillance powers. Counsel, Justice Chang said, his voice cutting through the formal atmosphere of the courtroom, "You're asking us to apply 18th century constitutional language to technologies the framers couldn't have imagined. How do we balance their intent with contemporary realities?" The attorney's response was technically competent but ultimately unsatisfying. A recitation of existing precedent, but avoided grappling with the fundamental question Justice Chang had posed. Sarah scribbled notes about the gap between legal doctrine and technological reality, thinking about how constitutional principles should evolve to address challenges the framers never anticipated. Back in chambers, Justice Chang asked for her thoughts on the arguments she'd observed. The government's position treats digital privacy as fundamentally different from physical privacy, Sarah said. But from a constitutional perspective, I'm not sure that distinction makes sense. The Fourth Amendment protects people's reasonable expectations of privacy, not specific technologies. Go on, Justice Chang encouraged. If we accept that digital communications deserve less protection than physical documents, we're essentially allowing technology to erode constitutional rights. The framers couldn't have anticipated cell phones, but they understood the principle that government power needs constitutional constraints. Justice Chang nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly the kind of analysis I want to see in your draft opinions. Don't just apply existing precedent. Think about how constitutional principles should guide us when precedent is incomplete or unclear. The religious liberty case became Sarah's major project for the term. Justice Chang assigned her to draft the first version of what would become the majority opinion, a responsibility that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Supreme Court opinions weren't just legal documents. They were statements of national principle that would be studied, debated, and applied for generations. Sarah spent weeks crafting language that would protect religious liberty without undermining civil rights protections. The case involved a religious nonprofit organization that refused to provide contraceptive coverage to employees, claiming such coverage violated their religious beliefs. The organization's opponents argued that religious freedom couldn't justify discrimination against women seeking reproductive health care. Her draft opinion attempted to thread this constitutional needle by distinguishing between religious exercise and secular discrimination. Religious organizations should have broad freedom to operate according to their beliefs, she argued, but that freedom couldn't extend to imposing those beliefs on employees who didn't share them. The Free Exercise Clause protects religious liberty, not religious supremacy, she wrote. Constitutional protection for religious belief cannot become a license to restrict others' constitutional rights. Justice Chang reviewed her draft with characteristic thoroughness, suggesting revisions that strengthened the legal reasoning while softening language that might seem unnecessarily provocative. It was a masterclass in judicial writing, how to craft opinions that advanced constitutional principles while building consensus among justices with different philosophical approaches. Good legal writing is like good architecture, he told her during one of their editing sessions. It needs to be both beautiful and functional, inspiring and practical. You want future generations to build on your foundation, not tear it down and start over. The collaborative process of opinion writing fascinated Sarah. Justice Chang circulated drafts to other chambers, incorporated suggestions from justices who planned to join the majority, and negotiated language changes that would hold together a coalition of 5 votes. Constitutional law, she realized, was as much about building consensus as it was about legal analysis. When the final opinion was announced in March, Sarah sat in the courtroom listening to Justice Chang read excerpts from language she had originally drafted. The words had been refined and improved through months of collaboration, but the core reasoning remained recognizably hers. She was watching her constitutional analysis become part of American law. The decision was praised by civil rights groups as a measured balance between religious liberty and anti-discrimination principles, while religious organizations appreciated the court's recognition of their constitutional protections. Editorial writers called it a careful compromise that avoided the extremes both sides had feared. Justice Chang found Sarah in the chamber's library that afternoon, surrounded by casebooks and legal journals. "How does it feel to see your work become a Supreme Court precedent?" he asked. Sarah looked up from her research, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. "Surreal, and overwhelming, and incredible." "It should feel overwhelming," Justice Chang said. "Constitutional law affects millions of lives. If it ever stops feeling overwhelming, you're probably not taking it seriously enough." As her clerkship year drew to a close, Sarah began considering her next steps. The traditional path for Supreme Court clerks led to elite law firms, federal appellate clerkships, or prestigious academic positions. Several firms had already reached out with offers that would pay more money than she'd ever imagined earning. But Sarah found herself drawn back to the kind of constitutional litigation that had first inspired her interest in law. During a conversation with Justice Chang about her future plans, she mentioned her inclination to return to civil rights work. "Admirable choice," he said. "The court needs lawyers who understand that constitutional principles matter most when they protect those who lack political power. Your perspective has been valuable this year, precisely because you haven't forgotten where you came from." Justice Chang paused, studying her with the same careful attention he brought to complex legal questions. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," he said. "I've been watching your development as a constitutional lawyer, and I think you have the potential for something special. Have you ever considered that someday you might want to sit where I'm sitting?" Sarah blinked, momentarily speechless. The idea of becoming a federal judge, much less a Supreme Court justice, seemed so far beyond her current reality that she'd never seriously contemplated it. "I know it seems premature," Justice Chang continued, "but judicial careers are built over decades. The experience you gain in the next 10 or 15 years will determine whether you're positioned for appointment to the federal bench when opportunities arise." He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thin folder. "These are some thoughts I've compiled about career paths that typically lead to judicial nominations. It's not a guarantee, obviously, but it might help you think strategically about your professional development." That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment near Capitol Hill, reading Justice Chang's notes by lamplight. The career path he outlined was ambitious almost to the point of fantasy: years of high-profile constitutional litigation, building a national reputation as a legal scholar, developing relationships with politicians and legal organizations that might someday support a judicial nomination. But as Sarah traced the trajectory he'd mapped out, she began to see how her unconventional background might actually be an asset. Federal judges were increasingly expected to bring diverse perspectives to the bench, and her experience growing up in Detroit, working with legal aid organizations, and approaching constitutional law from the perspective of those who needed its protections, most could set her apart from more traditional candidates. For the first time since receiving her Supreme Court clerkship, Sarah allowed herself to imagine an even more ambitious goal. Not just arguing cases before the Supreme Court, but someday sitting behind the bench where Justice Chang now served. It was a dream so audacious that she barely dared acknowledge it, even to herself. But as she sat surrounded by constitutional law books in her small apartment, Sarah remembered the 15-year-old girl who had refused to accept that challenging authority was a character flaw. That girl had become a Supreme Court law clerk despite everyone's expectations. Maybe she could become something even more extraordinary. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. But Sarah Matthews had spent her entire life exceeding expectations that had been set too low. Perhaps it was time to set them impossibly high and see how far her determination could carry her. 15 years after leaving Justice Chang's chambers, Sarah Matthews stood before the bathroom mirror in her Washington law office at 5:47 a.m., adjusting the navy blue suit she'd chosen for what could be the most important day of her career. The reflection staring back at her bore little resemblance to the uncertain girl who had once been told she'd never amount to anything. At 43, Sarah had become one of the nation's most respected constitutional lawyers. Her name synonymous with landmark civil rights victories that had reshaped American jurisprudence. The path from Supreme Court clerk to this moment had been anything but linear. After completing her clerkship, Sarah had turned down lucrative offers from white shoe firms to join the Constitutional Law Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting civil liberties through strategic litigation. It was a decision that had baffled many of her former colleagues, but Justice Chang had understood. "You're thinking long-term," he'd told her during their final meeting. "Building the kind of career that creates real change takes patience and purpose." Her first major case at the Constitutional Law Center had involved challenging unconstitutional surveillance programs implemented after 9/11. Sarah spent 2 years building an argument that digital privacy deserved the same Fourth Amendment protections as physical spaces, ultimately winning a decision that established crucial precedents for the digital age. The victory earned her national recognition and established her reputation as a lawyer who could translate constitutional principles into contemporary contexts. The cases that followed had only enhanced that reputation. She successfully argued before circuit courts across the country, challenging voter suppression tactics, defending reproductive rights, and establishing new protections for LGBTQ+ individuals. Each victory built on the last, creating a body of constitutional law that expanded civil rights protections while respecting traditional legal frameworks. But it was the Rodriguez case that had truly changed everything. Maria Rodriguez was a 17-year-old high school student in Arizona who had been arrested for organizing protests against immigration enforcement policies at her school. Local authorities had charged her under an old sedition statute that criminalized encouraging resistance to lawful authority, arguing that her activism constituted a threat to public order. When Sarah first read about Maria's case in the newspaper, she saw echoes of her own teenage years. a young woman being punished for asking uncomfortable questions, for refusing to accept that existing systems were beyond challenge. But she also saw something more, an opportunity to establish crucial First Amendment protections for student activists whose voices were increasingly important in American political discourse. The case had taken 3 years to wind its way through the court system. Sarah argued before the Arizona Supreme Court, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and finally, in a moment that felt like destiny fulfilled, before the United States Supreme Court. Standing at the podium in the chamber where she'd once sat as a clerk, facing justices who now included her former mentor, Justice Chang, Sarah had made the case that students' speech deserved robust constitutional protection. The First Amendment's promise of free speech is most vital when it protects unpopular ideas expressed by those who lack political power, she'd argued. If we allow authorities to silence student activists simply because their message makes adults uncomfortable, we abandon the principle that democracy depends on the right to challenge existing arrangements. The court's decision in Rodriguez v. Arizona had been unanimous, a rarity in contemporary constitutional law. Justice Chang had written the majority opinion, language that read like a love letter to the principle that constitutional rights belonged to everyone, not just those with the power to claim them easily. The victory had made Sarah a legal celebrity. Profile pieces appeared in major newspapers and magazines, legal scholars debated her constitutional theories at academic conferences, and her phone rang constantly with interview requests from journalists trying to understand how a working-class kid from Detroit had become one of the Supreme Court's most effective advocates. More importantly, the Rodriguez decision had attracted the attention of political leaders who were beginning to consider the future composition of the federal judiciary. When Justice Patricia Williams announced her retirement from the Supreme Court the following spring, Sarah's name appeared on every list of potential nominees. The call from the White House had come on a Thursday afternoon in June. Sarah was reviewing briefs for an upcoming circuit court argument when her assistant informed her that the president's counsel wanted to schedule a meeting. She'd known immediately what it meant. The vetting process had been exhaustive. FBI background checks, interviews with colleagues and law school classmates, reviews of every brief she'd written and every speech she'd given. Sarah had cooperated fully while trying to maintain her regular caseload, knowing that any misstep could derail an opportunity that might never come again. The formal announcement had taken place in the Rose Garden on a sweltering July morning. Standing beside the president, as he introduced her as his nominee to replace Justice Williams, Sarah had thought about all the moments that had led to this one. Her mother's dismissive words, Marcus's conventional success, Justice Chang's quiet encouragement, the countless hours spent crafting constitutional arguments that would protect people like Maria Rodriguez. The Senate confirmation hearings had been brutal. For 3 days, Sarah had faced questions designed to trap her into revealing political biases or constitutional philosophies that might alarm senators from either party. She'd navigated the process with careful precision, answering technical questions about judicial methodology, while avoiding the kind of specific commitments that would compromise her ability to judge future cases impartially. Senator Patricia Morrison from Texas had been particularly aggressive, repeatedly pressing Sarah about her civil rights work and suggesting that her background made her unsuitable for the supposed neutrality required of Supreme Court justices. Ms. Matthews, Senator Morrison had said during the second day of hearings, "Your entire career has been spent advocating for liberal causes. How can the American people trust that you'll set aside those biases and judge cases fairly?" Sarah had paused, thinking about how to respond to a question that seemed to assume advocacy for constitutional rights was somehow disqualifying for a Supreme Court justice. "Senator, I've spent my career advocating for constitutional principles, not political outcomes. The Constitution belongs to all Americans, regardless of their political affiliations. My job, if confirmed, would be to ensure that constitutional protections apply equally to everyone who seeks the law's protection." The exchange had been replayed on news programs for days, with legal commentators debating whether Sarah had adequately addressed concerns about judicial neutrality. But the fundamental question, whether someone who had spent her career protecting civil rights could be trusted to interpret the Constitution fairly, revealed the deep political tensions surrounding contemporary judicial nominations. The confirmation vote had been closer than anyone anticipated, 52 to 48, with 3 Republican senators joining all Democrats in supporting her nomination. Sarah had watched the proceedings from her law office, surrounded by colleagues and friends who had worked on her behalf during the confirmation process. When the final vote was announced, the room erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah had felt overwhelming relief, mixed with the weight of new responsibilities. She was going to be a Supreme Court justice, the first person in her family to graduate from college, now ascending to the pinnacle of American jurisprudence. Elena had flown to Washington for the swearing-in ceremony, her pride finally unrestrained by the practical concerns that had dominated Sarah's childhood. At 71, Elena moved more slowly than she once had, but her eyes shone with an emotion Sarah had rarely seen during her youth. "I always knew you were special," Elena had said the night before the ceremony, words that rewrote decades of painful history between them. "I just didn't know how to help you become what you were meant to be." Marcus had come too, bringing his wife and 2 young children who stared wide-eyed at the Supreme Court building where their aunt would soon work. The brother-sister dynamic that had defined Sarah's childhood had evolved into something more complex. Mutual respect, tinged with the acknowledgement that their paths had diverged in ways neither had anticipated. "You've exceeded every expectation," Marcus told her during a quiet moment at the family dinner the night before her investiture, "even mine." Justice Chang had administered the oath of office in a private ceremony attended only by family and close friends. As Sarah placed her hand on the Constitution and repeated the words that had been spoken by every Supreme Court justice since 1789, she thought about the teenage girl who had refused to accept her mother's limitations, the law student who had been told to temper her idealism, the young lawyer who had been warned against challenging established systems. Now here she was, becoming part of the very institution she had once viewed from the outside, positioned to help shape constitutional interpretation for generations of Americans who would never know her name, but whose lives would be affected by her decisions. The public investiture ceremony had taken place the following week in the court's main chamber. Sarah sat in the chair that would be hers for the rest of her career, looking out at an audience that included civil rights leaders, legal scholars, former clients, and the law school professors who had helped nurture her constitutional vision. Chief Justice Roberts had spoken about the court's role in American democracy, emphasizing the responsibility each justice bore to interpret the Constitution faithfully, regardless of personal political preferences. But Sarah had found her attention drawn to the young law clerks sitting in the audience, bright-eyed graduates who reminded her of her own younger self. Among them was a young black woman who looked to be about the same age Sarah had been when she first arrived at Justice Chang's chambers. The woman was taking careful notes, her expression suggesting the same mixture of intellectual excitement and professional ambition that had driven Sarah's own career. When their eyes met across the chamber, Sarah offered a small nod of acknowledgement. That young woman might not know it yet, but she was looking at proof that the highest levels of American law were accessible to people who hadn't been born into legal dynasties, who had grown up questioning authority rather than accepting it without examination. The ceremony concluded with Chief Justice Roberts' traditional words, "The court will please rise for the Honorable Sarah Elizabeth Matthews, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States." The gavel came down with the same thunderous crack that had marked countless historic moments in American jurisprudence. As the audience rose to their feet, Sarah felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a responsibility she had spent her entire life preparing to carry. Elena was crying in the front row, no longer able to contain emotions that had been building for decades. This was her daughter, the child she had once dismissed as too argumentative and challenging, now being honored by the highest court in the land. Justice Chang, now in his 70s but still sharp as ever, caught Sarah's eye and smiled with the satisfaction of a mentor who had watched his protégé exceed even his most optimistic expectations. He had seen something in that earnest young law clerk 15 years ago, some combination of intellectual rigor and moral purpose that suggested she might someday sit where he was sitting. As the formal ceremony concluded and guests moved to the reception, Sarah found herself standing alone for a moment in the Supreme Court chamber where she would spend the next decades of her career. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. The journey from a cramped apartment in Detroit to the marble halls of the nation's highest court seemed almost impossible to comprehend. But as she stood there, surrounded by centuries of constitutional history, Sarah realized that her mother had been both wrong and right all those years ago. Elena had been wrong to believe that Sarah could never match Marcus's achievements. But she had been right about one thing: Sarah would never be like her brother. She had become something entirely her own, a voice for constitutional principles that protected the powerless, an advocate for justice who had never forgotten where she came from, a Supreme Court justice who understood that the law's highest purpose was to ensure that democracy's promises applied to everyone. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new constitutional questions, new opportunities to shape American law. But tonight, Sarah Matthews, Associate Justice Sarah Matthews, allowed herself a moment to appreciate how far she had traveled from that kitchen table, where a mother's words had once seemed like a verdict on her potential. The young woman who had been told she'd never be like her brother had become something no one in her family had ever imagined possible. She had become exactly who she was always meant to be. And in courtrooms across America, other young people who had been told to lower their expectations, to accept limitations imposed by others' narrow vision, would see Justice Matthews and understand that the highest levels of American achievement were open to anyone willing to fight for constitutional principles that mattered more than personal comfort. The gavel had fallen, the oath had been taken. Justice Sarah Elizabeth Matthews was ready to begin the most important work of her life. 3 months later, as Sarah settled into the rhythm of Supreme Court life, she received an unexpected visitor in her chambers. A young woman named Destiny Williams, fresh out of law school and working as a clerk for the D.C. Circuit, had requested a brief meeting. She was the same young black woman Sarah had noticed taking notes during her investiture ceremony. "Justice Matthews," Destiny said, her voice carrying the same nervous determination Sarah remembered from her own early career, "I wanted to thank you. Seeing someone like me on the Supreme Court, someone who didn't come from wealth or connections, it changed what I thought was possible." Sarah invited Destiny to sit, recognizing in the young woman's earnest expression the same hunger for justice that had driven her own journey. They talked for an hour about constitutional law, about the challenges facing young lawyers from non-traditional backgrounds, about the responsibility that came with breaking barriers. As Destiny prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "My grandmother always told me I'd never amount to anything because I asked too many questions. But watching your confirmation hearings, seeing you refuse to apologize for fighting for what's right, it made me realize that asking questions isn't a weakness. It's exactly what this country needs." Sarah smiled, thinking about Elena's words from decades ago, about all the young people who had been told to lower their expectations. "Keep asking those questions, Destiny. The Constitution depends on it." After Destiny left, Sarah sat in her chambers surrounded by law books and pending cases, understanding more clearly than ever that her appointment wasn't just about her own achievement. It was about every young person who would see her robes and realize that the highest levels of American justice were open to anyone willing to fight for constitutional principles that protected everyone, not just the privileged few. The Supreme Court building stood, as it always had, a marble monument to American ideals. But now it housed a justice who remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, who understood that true constitutional interpretation required hearing voices that had been marginalized for too long. Sarah Elizabeth Matthews had become exactly what her mother said she never could be, not like her brother, but something far more important. She had become a guardian of constitutional principles who would never forget that justice mattered most when it protected those who needed it desperately. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.